You admire me, Mr. Darcy?
Indeed. In fact, I wrote to my sister Georgiana telling her about you already. She looks forward to making your acquaintance.
Although Elizabeth was not opposed to meeting Miss Darcy, especially after learning of her harrowing ordeal with Mr. Wickham, she could think of no occasion for such an introduction. Not if Mr. Darcy intended her for his friend Mr. Bingley, as Caroline Bingley had suggested. Your sister is very kind, I am sure.
Indeed, though she has suffered more than she ought to have for a girl of her tender years. I confess it is one of the reasons I look forward to you two making each other's acquaintance.
That again. Perhaps he does not intend his sister for Mr. Bingley. Perhaps he knows the gentleman's heart belongs to my sister Jane. Then a meeting between Miss Darcy and me is entirely in the cards, what with Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bingley being such loyal friends. Mr. Darcy, if you suppose a mutual acquaintance will be advantageous, then I shall contemplate our meeting each other with satisfaction. What is more, I can hardly wait. Jane will be delighted. Mr. Darcy smiled. How handsome his dimples rendered him! Were it not for his excess of pride, Elizabeth might well understand why other ladies found him attractive. Darcy and she stood mere steps from the parsonage gate when the skies opened and rain began to fall. After looking at each other and agreeing that they had better head inside the house as soon as possible, they made tracks to the door. Moments after entering the modest foyer, their coats dripping with rain, a maid addressed them. She accepted their wet things, which had spared them the worst of the downpour, and handed Elizabeth a fresh linen cloth to wipe her face. Grateful, Elizabeth smiled. Is Mrs. Collins in the parlour? No, Ma'am. Mr. and Mrs. Collins are both out. Have you any idea where they are, or when to expect their return? Mrs. Collins told me to tell you to expect her later this afternoon, Ma'am. She and the master went to the village to attend the old widow Scott. Her health has suffered a dreadful setback. Her kin expressed their fears she might not be with us much longer when they came around asking for Mr. Collins. What disheartening news! The gusting wind and pounding rain against the heavy wooden door cast an equal uncertainty over the timing of the Collinses' return. Elizabeth looked at Darcy apologetically. With the house empty, save for the servants, decorum dictated he did not remain with her. However, sending him out in the storm seemed severe. I fear you are left with my sole company for a bit longer, sir.
I shall not consider it a burden. Whilst the maid busied herself with draping their soaked coats, Darcy spoke in a hushed tone. I shall consider this time alone with you a pleasure, Miss Elizabeth. Elizabeth's eyes opened wide. Did she hear him correctly? How might a gentleman of his means derive pleasure from being confined in such meagre conditions as the parsonage afforded, when the comforts of Rosings existed a half-mile away? Perhaps he equated comfort with civility, in which case she might well oblige. She turned to the servant. May I trouble you to prepare tea? It is no trouble, Ma'am. Thank you, Mrs. Hunter. Elizabeth turned to Darcy. Will you join me, sir? Darcy followed Elizabeth down a narrow corridor to the parlour. Both walked over to a large window and stared at the huge streaks of rain tracking their way down the panes. It would be just the two of them, alone at the parsonage house for quite a while. For what sane creatures would dare brave the storm by venturing out of doors, unless they were already out there in its midst? Elizabeth certainly prayed her dear friend Charlotte and Mr. Collins were somewhere safe and dry. Bothered by her wet hair dripping on her shoulders, Elizabeth slightly tilted her head, gathered her loosened hair to one side, and began wringing it dry with the cloth the maid had given her. Marvelling at the spectacular prospect of the battering wind and rain, she said, It seems we were imprudent not to heed Lady Catherine's advisement on the weather. Flashing bolts of lightning and thunder louder than anything she had ever heard rocked the parsonage. The house shaking, the windows clattering, her heart pounding, Elizabeth fretted. Frightened moments later, she silently questioned what all took place. Better still, why was she standing face to face with Mr. Darcy in his arms?